You may have heard that automation is going to profoundly change the way our societies work. Not in 100 years, but maybe in the next decade. You may have heard that you're unlikely to have a job when that happens, that this will be a big tipping point that changes human destiny. And there is truth in that, up to a point. Well, let's have a look. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, automation has been a huge force reshaping our society, and so far we've benefited massively in terms of our living standards. Not only that, but for every job that was lost to a machine along the way, at least one new job was created. Didn't make the process painless by any means. The disruptions have been real. For some people it was utterly ruinous, but overall as a society things got better. And eventually most people were retrained and relocated and found new opportunities, and many of them ended up better for having done so. So why are people now so worried about the changes they see that are going on and the bigger changes that they hear are coming down the pipe? It's largely because in the past there were clear things that machines could do better than humans, but there were likewise clear things that humans could easily do better than machines. Computers can do hard things really easily, such as computing huge quantities of financial data, but things that human cognition handles without even thinking about it, such as recognizing someone, picking ripe fruit, understanding why someone's upset, creating a work of art, driving someone to the airport. Those were all things that machines could not do at all. Now, artificial intelligence, AI, is starting to outperform humans in more and more of those skills. And this is the thing. If humans lose out in both physical and cognitive tasks, what's actually left that humans can keep as an edge? Where are the jobs of tomorrow going to come from? In his book, Automation and the Future of Work, Aaron Bananov argued that what he called the automation discourse of recent times has four main propositions. 1. Workers are already being displaced by ever more advanced machines, resulting in rising levels of technological unemployment. 2. This displacement is a sign that we're on the verge of achieving a largely automated society, in which nearly all work will be performed by self-moving machines and intelligent computers. 3. Although automation should mean humanity's collective liberation from toil, we live in a society where people must work in order to live. And 4. Therefore, the only way to prevent a mass unemployment catastrophe is to institute a universal basic income, breaking the connection between the size of the incomes people earn and the amount of work that they do. There's been a slew of books exploring this future, some from a pro-capitalism perspective, others from left-wing writers arguing that basic income could serve as a bridge to what they describe as fully automated luxury communism. No reason why such a phrase should set off any alarm bells at all, obviously. Before we look at whether that discourse holds up, let's just review how automation has played out in human history. Because for most of that history, many thousands of years, we made painfully, crawlingly slow progress. In terms of human social development and also population growth, we were stuck in the same groove throughout the move to agriculture, through wars and empires, philosophies and religions. Nothing much changed the basic reality of life. That changed with the Industrial Revolution, and specifically it came with the progress James Watt made with the steam engine. Before Watt, the steam engines had been very inefficient, making use of just 1% of the energy released by burning coal. Watt's improvements in the decade leading up to 1776 boosted that efficiency threefold, which still doesn't sound great, but it made all the difference. It took several decades before it really took off, but once it did, the steam revolution became one of the biggest and fastest transformations in the history of the world. And that's worth noting, because some say we've seen a similar effect with computers. We've been going through a relatively slow period with their introduction, but the tipping point is going to leave us breathless with its speed and pace. Now, the Industrial Revolution also had plenty of negative impacts. It wiped out jobs in a number of sectors, which led to the Luddite movement, the skilled craftsmen fighting back against the machines, a fight that they were never going to win. It also saw massive air pollution with the springing up of hundreds of factories in close proximity. It saw child labour as families tried to make ends meet in difficult circumstances. But as we've seen in many societies since, as incomes rose, then those negative impacts became more and more unacceptable. Child labour was abolished in law, clean air regulations were brought in. Ultimately, societies had to manage the bad consequences of change, and they did so. And right from the earliest days, people were predicting that the machines would abolish the need to work and bring in what was envisaged to be a golden age of leisure. For example, Charles Babbage in On the Economy of Machinery and Manufactures in 1832, and John Adolphus Etzler in The Paradise Within Reach of All Men Without Labour in 1833. Visions of automated factories were discussed in such terms in the 1930s and the 1950s, then again in the 1980s. Amy Sue Bix in Inventing Ourselves Out of Jobs noted that every time there were also dire predictions of unemployment and social breakdown that could only be prevented if society were reorganised. Obviously, just because these things were wrong in the past doesn't necessarily mean they must be wrong today. But the details will almost certainly be wrong. Whenever we speculate about how new technology will change our lives, the reality always turns out to be different, usually less exceptional than the predictions. I was told as a kid we'd have flying cars by now. Instead, we have normal cars that have sat-nav. Still amazing, but different. But it's the changes on the societal level that are really important. The Industrial Revolution predominantly created economic growth because it raised the productivity of workers. You can enjoy a higher standard of living if the number of hours of labour that it takes to produce something goes down, because more can then be produced, the benefits of which are enjoyed by the population at lower cost. And productivity growth comes down to innovation. New technologies that are more powerful and efficient, new technologies to create new products that make life better, because there's only so much that people can work harder. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the phrase creative destruction, said this: "Innovation is the outstanding fact in the economic history of capitalist society, and also it is largely responsible for most of what we would at first sight attribute to other factors." The economist Robert Gordon carried out a study of how the American standard of living has changed over the last 150 years. He was worried, and he argued that the pace of innovation has been slowing down. He said that the sharp growth curve of the last 200 years came from three novelties of the second wave revolution: electricity, the internal combustion engine, and indoor plumbing with running water. These great inventions were so important and far-reaching, they took a full 100 years to have their main effect. But once all that impact had played out, growth began to slow down around after 1970. The great inventions had done their thing. All that was left was second-round improvements. And Gordon's view was that automation had already mostly had its impact. The first industrial robot was introduced by General Motors in 1961. Telephone operators went away in the 1960s. Airline reservation systems came in the 1970s, and by 1980, barcode scanners and cash machines were spreading through the retail and banking sectors. The first personal computers arrived in the early 1980s. More recent, and thus more familiar, was the rapid development of the web and e-commerce after 1995, a process largely completed by 2005. But Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, in their book The Second Machine Age, largely disagreed. They suggested that innovation isn't just coming up with something big and new and shiny, but instead recombining things that already exist. They gave the example of Kari Mullis, who we know rather better now than we did when they wrote the book, won a Nobel Prize inventing the polymerase chain reaction, PCR technique, made famous, of course, by COVID-19. Mullis nearly dismissed his idea when it first came to him on a nighttime drive. He said, "I thought it had to be an illusion. It was too easy. There was not a single unknown in the scheme. Every step involved had been done already. But it wasn't an illusion. Later in life, he swore that he'd seen a glowing alien raccoon. It's possible that that was an illusion, but the PCR test was just a recombination that turned out to be a major innovation nonetheless. And Brynjolfsson and McAfee argue that the real twin engine that will be driving the future exponential growth is the emergence of artificial intelligence, AI, and connections of most people on the planet via digital networks. They also noted that you get a delayed reaction from the big game-changing innovations. The introduction of electricity had very little impact on productivity when it was first introduced because the early applications weren't really that useful. But soon it began to change the way that factories were designed and there was a rapid takeoff. So it will be, they suggest, with AI-driven automation for the computer age. To get some sense of the difference that AI makes, there's a rather mind-blowing example from the world of chess. Now I know, computers playing chess is nothing new. On the face of it, not really that big a deal. Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov back in 1997, and we know that it's just gotten better and better since then. The best standard chess playing program in 2016 was Stockfish 8. It had access to centuries of accumulated human experience in chess, as well as decades of computer experience as well. It was able to calculate 70 million chess positions per second. Safe to say, you and I would not be beating Stockfish 8. It was, however, beaten by AlphaZero. AlphaZero is an artificial intelligence program, and it was given no instructions on how to play chess except for the rules. It was taught no chess strategies, none of the standard chess openings. It used machine learning to teach itself by playing itself over and over again. While Stockfish 8 could do those 70 million positions per second, AlphaZero was a slow coach, just 80,000. I mean, even I could... well, maybe not. It was a relative slow coach. But AlphaZero, after just 4 hours teaching itself to play, managed to win 28 games out of 100, with all of the remainders being a draw. It didn't lose once. Not only that, but many of its winning moves and strategies were unconventional, unknown to human players. If it had been a human being, it would have been described as creative and almost certainly a chess genius. 4 hours it took to teach itself to do that. That's the difference we're talking about. So, of course, AI doctors are going to become way more powerful diagnostic forces than human beings. And of course, self-driving vehicles will ultimately emerge and will be far safer drivers than human beings. In a world where we seem to value safety over all else, that may well be the initial appeal of it, especially when it becomes reflected in insurance rates. AI is now at the point where it can overcome the old constraints. The really difficult thing in the last couple of decades was to get computers to do the things, as I said before, that human beings do without thinking. Moving around, navigating unexpected obstacles, picking things up that aren't in a set place, getting up if you've been knocked down. And that was why humans were always needed. Human beings could pick the right fruit in the fields easily and quickly. They could work with people, particularly in roles where you needed to be sensitive to how people were feeling. And so much more. Which was one reason why automation often could only work with human beings in cooperation, what became known as cobots. In some ways, this was the ideal. Technology made workers more productive without making work itself unnecessary. What's creating the stir now is that even that difference is coming to an end. Boston Dynamics is one company that's been building robots that can move around, negotiate uneven terrain, even remain stable if it's on an ice rink and you give it a kick. It can be used to view and analyse situations remotely. It can grip things, open doors, do all sorts of things. And I mean all sorts of things. This video of its robots dancing to Do You Love Me went viral. 1 million thumbs up. But many of the comments reflect uneasiness about where this leads. For now, you'll see that the adverts show robots working alongside humans, extending their capability and reach. And a lot of automation fits that model. So, for example, in the US Armed Forces, for replacement of human pilots by drones, that might just seem as though you're just losing pilots. But every unmanned Predator or Reaper drone needs 30 people to operate it. And the problem is that those are high-skilled jobs, which is not a problem if you're a high-skilled technician, at least not for now. But if the jobs of drivers and receptionists and cleaners and builders and waste disposal operatives and fruit pickers, if all those jobs get replaced by automation, then you have a problem with a huge number of displaced, unskilled labourers, leading people to ask whether we're going to see the rise over the coming decades of a new so-called useless class. Indeed, we might end up with a shortage of skilled labour while at the same time having chronic unemployment. The management consultants have all been offering their analysis of the changes that are coming. Bain & Co, for instance, estimate what sort of displacement might occur and show how it compares to history. So, quoting the US Bureau of Labour Statistics, the mechanisation of agriculture in the early 20th century saw nearly 40% of the labour force displaced over 4 decades. A huge move of workers from the land into the factories. Changes in manufacturing productivity in the latter part of the century displaced 13%. In construction early this century, 0.5%. But the automation of the future could see a quarter of the workforce displaced in just 1 or 2 decades. And whereas in the agriculture case they flooded into the factories, the open question now is, where do they go? And even for those that don't lose jobs, Bain suggests that many of the lower paid workers could find that their wage rates are pushed downwards. They suggest up to 80% will be affected to some degree. And it will happen simply because once the first companies begin putting in place new forms of automation, all of the others will be forced to follow suit quickly in order to stay competitive. Lots of low-skilled jobs had already been lost, of course. Companies have been using cheaper labour in developing economies, such as India and China. But even the jobs in India and China are not immune from this. The next generation robots will become cost competitive even against those workers, and Chinese and Indian firms are already investing accordingly. So the cobots, the collaborative robots, are already becoming highly competitive with all manufacturing workers, save for now, but not for long, China and India. Now, this doesn't play out quite as badly as it sounds, because it's not the only change that's going on. Demographic change is huge. The baby boomer generation is retiring, the growth of the labour force is at historic lows. And that's good news for younger workers, particularly those who can train in higher level skills, because they will be more scarce and that makes them valuable. In the past, growth was fueled by productivity, but also the growth in the workforce itself, sheer numbers. The surge of baby boomers powered labour growth in the 1970s and the 1980s, and then the entry of China and India more than tripled the size of the labour force in the decades after that. That effect ends now. So the rise of automation, cobots, to work alongside workers could be the engine of future productivity, which would make it possible for people to continue their quality of life, perhaps even for fewer hours worked. Without the positive impact of automation, we would be expecting some serious stagnation. As the total labour force declines and the swelling of the older age groups accelerates with surging healthcare costs and pensions and the like, we would be seeing significant slowing of growth. Seen through that lens, the rise of automation should be a positive. It's just that we need to find a way through public policy to ensure that the nightmare scenario of the impact on unskilled workers is avoided. If they have to be displaced, we want them to be short-term displaced, like the agricultural workers of old, rather than made wholly useless, like the farm horses of old. What does this look like? Well, this is why there's such a vigorous debate, and why some are starting to talk about things like this universal basic income scheme, where all citizens get paid a set minimum amount regardless of what they do. Bill Gates is advocating for a robots tax. The thinking goes that if robots are doing the work that people used to do, then they should contribute some of the wealth that work creates to support the displaced people. And there's something in that. I'm not convinced that it's wholly the way to go. When you see the moral and social degradation from the phenomenon of people existing on welfare, you realise that the utopia of everyone living a life of beautiful, artistic and constructive leisure, well, the human race isn't really wired to go there. Even so-called fully automated luxury communism is doomed to fail. And for the usual reason, it relies on people being different to how they actually are. People thrive when they have some sort of purpose. And that's why I think we will find ways to accommodate these changes within the standard capitalist process. I think people will opt for a version that means they retain agency over their lives rather than opt for full institutionalization. I mean, I may be wrong. But there are other reasons why that might be the case, because there are going to be other risks that have to be managed. The more interconnected and automated systems become, the larger the potential that something goes wrong and then goes rapidly to scale. We've seen it already. High-frequency trading on the stock market is driven by multiple algorithms. On May the 6th, 2010, at 2:42 p.m. precisely, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged by 9% in a matter of minutes, wiping $1 trillion in asset value off the books. A single large sale for a security for which there weren't enough buyers triggered a sudden decline. That then triggered dozens of automated routines that were trying to prevent losses by selling at any price, and it became an enormous cascade of consequences. And it all stopped because one of the exchanges, presumably at the initiative of an actual human being, stopped trading for 5 seconds. It was enough time for the software programs to reset, and the problem just went away. That, along with a lot of the trust that people had in financial systems, because such failures have consequences. The more you automate, the more risk that comes from failure. As Jerry Kaplan says in his book, Humans Need Not Apply, when we're dependent on a pervasive and complex web of autonomous systems to grow, process, deliver and prepare our food, it's going to be very hard to pull the plug without condemning millions to starvation. That may be one reason why we don't wholly cede human control to these systems. Cobots may well be preferable to fully automated robots in the long run, not just in the short term. But either way, there's going to be change over the coming decades. The demographics demand it, the technology enables it. There are no evil genius billionaires making this happen in order to implement their control across society. Klaus Schwab is not doing this. The nightmare scenario isn't the wealthy 1% finding a new way to control you, as the conspiracists believe. The nightmare scenario is that circumstances conspire to make you of no value to them, or indeed to anyone else. It's the uneasy recognition of that possibility that I think is fueling the readiness of people to believe the conspiracy theories. But it's not true. It has an echo of truth, and that's what makes it persuasive. It shouldn't surprise us that big changes are coming. Big changes have to come, because the human race and the planet has not been in this position before. Growth of a species went through this exponential increase, and it's now levelling off. That's never happened before. We have to find new ways of being. Technology has reached the point where useful work can be done without human intervention at all. That's never happened before. We have to find ways to make it work. Those who think that we need to defend our sense of community and our institutions and all the things we value from some of the implications of this new world, you're not wrong. But we won't do that by thinking we can simply fight off the changes. Look at it this way. Every time of change is a time of opportunity and also of risk. When you're in one of those times, you have to focus, you have to engage, you have to work hard to make it into the opportunity and not the disaster. Remember, the Industrial Revolution had negative impacts. It was a disaster for some, usually those who resisted the change. but then we dealt with the impacts. In the interconnected age, where we do actually care about what happens to people, you'd really think we would be capable of making this work.